So oxalates and disease. What do we know about oxalate in the relationship to disease? Oxalates can increase the risk for inflammatory bowel diseases. Little tiny crystals. Oxalates are little tiny crystals, and so they can be little tiny shards. It's like little tiny glass shards that can cut and lacerate your tissue microscopically. So inflammatory bowel disease. Well, what is that? Inflammatory bowel disease. That's ulcerative colitis. It's Crohn's. And it's celiac disease. So celiac disease. And then we got arthritis. I mentioned earlier rheumatoid arthritis, but lupus. Okay, there's research now showing that oxalates might have linkage to autism and then interstitial cystitis. I'm going to show you more. Actually, let's go ahead and pull that up here. Let's see here. Kind of a bigger, longer list of different problems. Okay, so you can see here, oxalate toxicity, common symptoms, abdominal discomfort. So we're going back and forth in between disease and symptoms because I want you to understand both. In essence, you may have abdominal discomfort, but you may not have yet developed inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis or celiac. So remember, these diseases typically start as discomfort before they manifest as disease. So we're thinking about kind of symptoms of oxalate toxicity. Pain. So you can get, where I see this is very commonly in the wrists, I see it in the knees, I see it in the feet, in the toes. It sometimes will mimic gout. Okay, so those of you who maybe don't or do know what gout is a disease where your big toe can swell really big, turn really, really red. Gout commonly affects the toes, but oxalate crystal toxicity can affect the toes as well, particularly the big toe, and it can mimic gout. And so one of the things I've actually seen this happen, people have come to see me, they were diagnosed with gout, they didn't have gout, they actually had an oxalate problem, okay, an oxalate toxicity problem. And so they were on a medicine. There's a particular type of medicine called allopurinol, which is used to treat gout because it helps with the clearance of uric acid. And it doesn't, in these cases where somebody has what doctors are calling gout, but it's not been properly diagnosed or hasn't been accurately assessed, and they don't really have gout, allopurinol is not going to do anything for you. So if you've got a diagnosis of gout and you're on allopurinol and you get zero relief, go back to your doctor and ask them about measuring for oxalates, running what's called an OAT or an oat test, and that's not like eat your oats, but that stands for organic acids test. And this can be done to help rule out whether or not you have an oxalate toxicity issue or an overabundance of oxalates. One of the other things you can do, if your doctor won't run a test for you, is you can go on a low oxalate diet. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. But pain anywhere in the body, but again, particularly that pain oftentimes can mimic rheumatological or autoimmune arthritis. So again, it doesn't have to be rheumatoid arthritis or gout. It can actually mimic a number of different painful conditions. As I mentioned earlier, interstitial cystitis is pain in the bladder, so pain on urination. That comes back down here to urinary problems, but the urinary problems, again, can create pain in the bladder. So pain anywhere in the body, and again, pain is a symptom or manifestation. For some people, diarrhea or constipation, oxalates can contribute to. Brain fog is a big one. Again, these things, just like they can get through the blood-brain or the GI tract barrier, they can also get through your blood-brain barrier and potentially damage neurologically, create neurological symptoms, and brain fog being one of those. Muscle weakness is a common symptom associated with it. Mood changes or mood swings, these two go hand in hand, right? With brain fog comes mood changes, irritability, that type of thing. Muscle weakness, lack of coordination, this can be neurological, but it can also be part of that muscular weakness. As the crystals deposit into the tissue and damage the tissue and create inflammation in the tissue, it can create the kind of systemic breakdown. You remember going back to what we've talked about before, when this type of thing happens, your body tries to respond by increasing cortisol output because cortisol reduces inflammation. But unfortunately, if this happens for a long time, so chronically, if this is happening and you don't know it, and it happens for a year, 2 years, 3 years, that increased cortisol over time will also lead to loss of muscle. So it will degrade your muscle tissue. It leads to muscle loss, which then leads to joint compression and greater degrees of pain. So then you end up developing more than one problem. Maybe a problem that started with oxalate toxicity, but manifested over time as chronic inflammation, which led to the hormonal imbalance and muscle wasting effects of that chronic inflammation. And then fatigue. Fatigue, a very, very common side effect. If you struggle with fatigue, maybe you're following a gluten-free diet, maybe even you're following a grain-free diet, like what's in No Grain, No Pain, and you're still struggling. Like, this is one of the things you might want to think about. Again, might want to ask your doctor to help test you for. And then skin rashes and skin lesions also can be a manifestation of oxalate toxicity. So all those things in combination can create problems that you want to be aware of. So if you're struggling with those things, but you've already changed your diet, that you want to definitely be aware of. Let's see here. Again, this next one, you can see here what contributes, kind of in summary. You've got gut inflammation. So it's kind of a double-edged thing here. Gut inflammation can increase oxalate toxicity, but oxalate toxicity can also cause gut inflammation. Medications. Okay, we said, and I mentioned antibiotics, but it doesn't stop at antibiotics. Medications come in the form of lots of things that can damage your GI tract. Actually, I did a really extensive show on medications that can cause leaky gut and gut problems, but some of the more common ones are pain medications, especially non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, NSAIDs, if you will. This class of medication is notorious for damaging the GI tract. Certain blood pressure medicines can damage the GI tract, particularly if you're on something called an ARB. ARB stands for angiotensin receptor blocker. So ARBs are drugs that actually have been shown to actually cause or mimic celiac disease. So these blood pressure medications, particularly if you've been on one of these and you suspect oxalate toxicity, again, go back to your doc and make sure. We mentioned as well, grains contribute to oxalate toxicity. Why? Because they're super high in oxalates, but also if we're talking about gluten damages the GI tract, so oxalates that are coming through in your diet can actually penetrate into your bloodstream and start depositing into your tissues a little bit easier. And then eating foods that are too high or eating too many foods that are high in oxalates can also contribute to this. Now, I want to be real cautious in talking with many of you because some of you may already feel like it's overwhelming, like you've changed your diet already and you feel like really super food restricted. So tonight I'm not talking about oxalates as kind of a carte blanche for all of you to just stop any food that has oxalate in it. What I'm trying to do is share information that might have bearing on why you might be still struggling. So we're going to talk about these high oxalate foods in just a minute. And then yeast overgrowth. There's some research that shows that specifically yeast can contribute or can produce oxalates as part of their element. So yeast overgrowth in the GI tract can oftentimes play a role in oxalate toxicity as well. So if you struggle with chronic yeast infections or yeast overgrowth, you want to be cautious there. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.